Okay, so in this video we're going to look at something a little bit more fun, and that is the set interval function in JavaScript. And essentially what this allows you to do, coupled with clear interval, is actually set a timer that goes every X amount of milliseconds that you provide. So we're going to go ahead and have a look at the syntax, and we're going to create just a global variable to demonstrate this, and we'll go ahead and create a loop for every second, and then we'll output something every second to the console. And this is extremely useful for a variety of different things. There are so many things that you can use this for. It's particularly useful for animation, so when you start working with the DOM, so elements on your page, you can actually animate them using this set interval. You can do a variety of different things, scroll to the top of a page, so animate a whole page, sort of scroll effect up, things that we've usually sort of take for granted with libraries such as jQuery. So bigger libraries that use these things behind the scenes that we necessarily sort of take for granted. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple interval, and we're going to console log a variety of things to the console. So for example, a new date, a timestamp or something like that, something that changes, just so we can monitor how this works each time. And we'll go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and first of all look at the syntax for creating a interval and how we actually pass in the functionality we need to pass in. There are two different ways that we can do this. We can go ahead and say var interval, for example, equals set interval. So that's the function name. It's just called as a standalone function like this. There's no it's not part of any method or anything like that. It's just a global function that we can make use of. Now, what we can do is we can either create a function beforehand to pass into this. So we could do something like get time. So we can define a function called get time, for example, which returns a new date dot get time, for example. So we could do something like this. On its own, get time is going to just return the sort of timestamp. So let's just get rid of interval and see what this initial function does before we do anything, because it's important to understand that you can actually pass in these things. So we've got a global function now called get time, and all that does is it will return the current timestamp. So if we do this, the number changes each time. We've already seen that in the past videos, so we know that this functionality exists. Now if we want to create the interval, we can go ahead and do that. So let's say interval equals set interval. So what we can now do is we can pass in either a closure or an anonymous function, or we can pass in a function that already exists, a named function. So we don't actually have to give the function that we want to repeat every X amount of milliseconds a name. We can pass in an anonymous function, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But there are mainly two parameters that we need for this, which is the name of the function that we want to run every amount of milliseconds, and the amount of milliseconds. So if I was to type in 1, that would be every 1 millisecond, so extremely rapid. But for now we'll choose 1,000, so we'll just choose 1 second. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens here. So when I refresh the page, and we call interval, let's have a look. Oh, okay, so this is just returning a new date at the moment. So let's just go ahead and console log this out, just for the sake of seeing what this outputs. So here you can now see that inside of the console, every second, this is outputting a new timestamp. So you can see the actual second here, the 6, 7, 8, 9, just in this little block here. So we can see that that's outputting a new time here every second. But what happens if we want to clear this interval at some point? Well, we'll first of all take a look at a closure within this rather than a named function. So let's go ahead and get rid of this and just have the interval here. Now let's go ahead and pass in a closure like that, and then we can go ahead in here and console log new date dot get time, for example. So now this has exactly the same effect as we've already seen. It does exactly the same thing, so it will just output a new timestamp every single second. So there's no change in the actual functionality here. Now let's look at clearing the interval, and what we'll do is we'll clear this based on a condition. So we'll go ahead and we'll create two variables. So we'll start again. We'll create a variable called x, and this is going to be 1, and then we'll go ahead and create an interval, and we'll say set interval function, and then we'll go ahead and pass in this every second. So what we want here is the aim of this is to count from 1 to 10 and then stop at 10 and clear the interval, because if we don't clear the interval, this interval will just carry on as long as the browser's open and as long as the code's running. So what we'll now do is inside of here we'll say x++, and then we'll go ahead and we'll create an if statement to check if this is got to 10 or not. So I'm going to go ahead and console log out x, and we'll just see what happens here. And we'll see that it will start at 1. It will start at 2 because we increment before that. So let's go ahead and set this down here. We could either do that or start at 0. So you can now see that we've got 1, 2, 3, and that will just carry on counting until we refresh the page or close the browser. Now if I was to go ahead down here and create an if statement to check whether x is equal to 10, and remember we're using a strict equals here, I can go ahead and I can use the clear interval function. So instead of set interval, this is clear interval, and all we need to do is pass the name of the interval that we created. So in this case it will just be interval because we named that up here, and that will just clear the interval and it won't allow this to run anymore. So when we go ahead and refresh now, you can see that this will count all the way up to 10, and when it reaches 10, that condition will be satisfied, so the interval will be cleared and we won't count any further. Now we've actually stopped at 9, and the reason being is that once we've hit this here, this clears before the x has a chance to increment again. So what we would have to do is place that down here. We'll change this to 5 just for the sake of time. So when I go ahead and refresh now, you can see that it'll count from 1 to 5. It'll actually get to 5 this time, and then it will go ahead and stop, and it won't run anymore. So that's how we use intervals. We've looked at passing a closure in, and we've looked at passing a named function in. We've looked at actually putting a condition in here to use the clear interval function, and we've basically created a cool little script that just counts up from 1 to 10. And of course this could go the other way as well. We could do something like minus, and we could start this at 5, and we could say if x equals 1. So if I go ahead and refresh now, you'll see that that will count backwards from 5 down to 1, and then when it gets to 1, that will just stop. There's only one thing that you need to bear in mind with an interval, and we can check this out just by console logging out hello, for example, and we'll get rid of this x, we don't need that anymore. And you'll notice that what will happen is when you refresh here, it takes a second before we actually get the initial output out. So it'll always take the time that you provide here to actually output the initial block. So for example, if I was to type in 5,000 here for 5 seconds, when I go ahead and refresh, I actually need to wait for 5 seconds before the initial hello actually outputs to the console there. So there is a way that we can actually deal with this, and that's using a named function. So what we would have to do in this case is we would have to go ahead and create a named function. So I'll create a named function called output hello, and I'll go ahead and I'll say console.log hello. We'll go ahead and get rid of the functionality in here, and instead of passing in a closure or an anonymous function, we'll do output hello. Now we get the same effect here. That hasn't actually solved the problem. You'll still see that when I refresh the page, it will take 5 seconds before that initial hello is actually output. But what we can do in this case is we can either do this to run the function immediately, so it automatically runs hello, and then after that, subsequently, it will run the interval if we specifically define it. However, probably the best way to do it, I mean, we're working with globals here, but what we actually can do here is we could probably say something like, in fact we could do that. I don't think that makes much difference. So for example, if we want that to output initially and then every second, we can do this. So when we refresh, it outputs hello, and then it will should output every second. Let's just check. Okay, so that's going to run once. So what we could actually do is separate these out, and then we could say down here, output hello. Remember, we're still working with globals, but it doesn't really matter in this case because we're just looking at an example. So we've got hello output there, and then we get hello output every second as well. So every second we get this hello output. And this circle here with the numbers just signifies that the same thing is being output. It doesn't repeat it down the page. So we've looked at intervals and how we can create intervals. Probably the nicest way that we could actually create an interval would be the previous way that we looked at. If I just undo all my changes, something like this works really, really well. So we've essentially here created a countdown from 5 to 1, and this is usually a good idea. So the most useful functionality of this, but otherwise it can be used for things like animation and various other things.